can you take us through, whether it's athletes, clients, trainers, some of the common mistakes you see at different levels, whether it's beginner, intermediate, or even advanced lifters?
Yeah, thanks. I start my book with a presentation of what I call the cardinal rule of training. And the cardinal rule of training is simple, and I think most people have it in their mind, and that is that to get better at things, you have to do it a lot. And if you're going to do something a lot, you have to be really consistent. The mistakes that people make in training across all levels are that they pay lip service to the cardinal rule, and they behave in a way that actually prejudices their consistency. Mm-hmm. So I guess a classic example of that is that athletes who overtrain. So kind of athletes have in their mind, okay, I need to train really, really hard because that's how I'm going to get better. But in training really, really hard, they either get injured or overtrain, which then means they miss loads of training and actually aren't consistent.
Yeah, it is incredible how well you lay out that cardinal rule, and how when we think about whether it's recreational clients or even athletes, that it is difficult for a lot of people to adhere to that idea of just consistency and really building up to things. And a quote from your book is, probably the most problematic guideline is the suggestion that to train for increases in strength, it is necessary to use loads of greater than 85%. So, dovetailing on what we just talked about, could you unpack that quote a little bit?
Yeah, so, if you look in any textbook as to what maximum strength training is, it's probably going to say that maximum strength training is training with an intensity of over 80 or 85%. And so kind of like a really classic strength training protocol would be to do 5 sets of 5 with 80 to 85% of your one repetition max. If you're to do a session like that, it's really hard. Like if you're a reasonably well-trained person, to do 5 sets of 5, say of a back squat with 85%, it is a really grueling workout. And the idea that you would do that type of workout week on week is just desperately unrealistic, and would lead to kind of quickly breaking or losing motivation.
Yeah, it is amazing how obviously the more advanced the lifter, the more apparent this becomes. And Dan, is that a result of oftentimes in science and in undergoing some of these studies, we're using more novice or collegiate student lifters versus the really advanced lifters, or what's going on here?
Yeah, that's my contention in the book, is that it's this guideline of 80 to 85% is a really classic and interesting example of how research can be misleading if you don't understand its context. And so, yeah, most research studies that have actually looked at the effect of training are done in less elite populations and over short time periods. And yeah, certainly if you're simply training for a few weeks, then using a percentage of your 1RM around about 80, 85% might be the most effective. But you can't train like that year round. And so kind of that guideline, which may be correct for a very, very short duration, it is nonsense if you're thinking about, okay, well, how am I going to develop an athlete over the course of 5 years?
Yeah, and something that really struck me as well in your book is this idea that a lot of the classic programs in Russia, the guidelines don't actually stipulate a rep range for strength or hypertrophy, but rather this volume intensity relationship and even a maximum number of reps to be performed. Can you explain that concept to listeners? Yeah,
so I kind of, as you say in the book, I contrast the Western research, which says, okay, you train at 85%, with some of the Russian research from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, where they kind of case study what the very strongest Russian weightlifters were doing. And those guys, they train at a much, much lighter intensity than will be suggested by the Western guideline, and get really, really strong using loads in the 60 to 70% range. I think it's also interesting as well that the more elite, or counterintuitively, the more elite you get, the lower the intensity of training that you do, or certainly in Russia, that was the case.
Yeah, it's interesting in terms of just obviously being, so strong in those loads, as you mentioned, a 5x5 if you're advanced, just how intense that is when you're a really advanced lifter versus somebody who is sort of just starting out. And if we shift gears here to more recreational lifters and talking about knowing where to start a program, obviously it's January, a lot of people of all levels are getting back to the gym.
Yeah.
And you talk about the minimum effective dose. So why is it important for them as well to start light? And what are some of the pitfalls if someone is kicking off a program here in January of starting too heavy?
Yeah, I mean, I think what people often don't realize is that if you haven't done something before, just doing a little bit of it is going to make you better. And so it's not really necessary to flog yourself to death in the weight room if you've never been in there before, because pretty much anything that you're going to do in there is going to help you to improve. And then the advantage of, holding something back is that, as you do improve, you've got somewhere else to go. So it's kind of, you don't spend these more demanding stimuli before you need to.
And Dan, is that something that you would still see? And I mean, I know in recreational gyms and stuff, that's definitely something we still see with trainers kind of really beating up new clients too excessively. But is that something that you still see in athletic circles or collegiate high school circles of going too heavy to start programs?
Yeah, very, very, very much so. At the most elite level, I have still seen Olympic medal winning athletes make big gains in strength just by going back to basics, but going back to basics in terms of the way that they load. So start light and progress sensibly rather than just hammering yourself all the time, which just means that you plateau and don't make improvements.
And you also make a great argument as well that wave loading is one of the most effective ways to make progress. And could you maybe define wave loading for anyone who might not be familiar, and talk about some of the ideal rates of progression?
Yeah, so I mean, personally in my practice, I use wave loading extensively. Wave loading is just an implementation of probably the most classic and historically true resistance training principles, and that is this principle of progressive overload. So that, if you train with something, you adapt to it and you get better, but then if you want to keep getting better, you have to increase the challenge. So wave loading is a very simple way of increasing the challenge, which is that you just each week increment the load that you're using. What I kind of try to stress in my book is that people who use wave loading strategies often tend to start heavier than they need to. Mm-hmm. And it means that they don't really have much variation in the load they do. They start hard, they're able to get a little bit harder, and then they have to go back and start again because they've run out of somewhere to go. Whereas a more productive wave loading scheme is to start light, be able to build up progressively over a period of weeks, and not have to work too hard to get better in the early and middle part of the cycle.
Yeah, such a great point. And obviously a lot of programs that you read in the blogosphere, online coaches, they often want trainees to really max out each wave, to keep going until they're really no longer improving. And you make a great point of suggesting, to start a new wave before an athlete or a client is maxing out. Can you discuss why?
Yeah, it's something that I've only come to recently, because I also used to kind of, run a wave protocol until the athlete really reaches their peak. But if you think about what you're doing, then you really are squeezing every last piece of adaptation out of the athlete. And so when they get to the end of that cycle, they're going to be pretty drained, and that's going to result in a necessary kind of dip in performance. In the book, I kind of use the analogy of a peak. So if you think about a mountain, if you go up one side to reach the peak, by definition, that means there's a big drop on the other side. And so, yeah, I think it's much better to kind of start building up through a cycle, get to a place where you're flying and everything is easy, and then go back down and start building up again, rather than continuing until everything starts getting hard again, even if you're a little bit stronger when everything starts getting hard again.